Hello, scholars. This is Mr. Myers on Lesson 2.2 Structure of the National Government, Part 2. Let's get this bread. As always, take good structured notes on the objectives. Today we're going to talk about the structure of the executive, the qualifications and terms for the executive succession issues, structure of the judiciary, and then the qualifications and terms of the judiciary. So let's start by talking a little bit about the structure of the executive branch. First of all, let's recognize that being the leader of the free world is a big job and that the President of the United States is definitely going to need some help with that. So underneath the President, you have the office of the Vice President. Depending on the kind of relationship the President has with the Vice President could delegate certain things for the Vice President to do, certain initiatives, or specializing in a certain area of domestic policy or foreign policy. So the Vice President and their office can be a real asset to the President. You also have the Executive Office of the Presidency, and under that you have three different entities. The first is the National Security Council. Now, the National Security Council is made up of representatives from the military and the defense industry, and they largely provide daily security briefings to the President of the United States, keeping him abreast of any national security issues. You also have the White House office, made up of all the staff who work in the White House that report directly to the President, like the press secretary. You also have the Office of Management and Budget, also known as the OMB. Now, the OMB is a nonpartisan part of the executive branch that provides recommendations and projections on cost, the amount of people or money that's going to be required to carry out a particular government initiative. So this is a really important tool to help guide the president on everything from budget to particular pieces of legislation. Now, you also have cabinet agencies. This is probably what most people think of when they think of the executive branch outside of the presidency. So this is the Department of State, the Department of the Interior, the Department of the Treasury, each run by a secretary, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, and so on and so forth. Each cabinet agency then is obviously designed to try to help the president run a particular aspect of the government. Now, you also have independent executive agencies, and these are agencies that are an important part of the bureaucracy but don't fit under the cabinet level agencies. An example of this would be the CIA. And one fundamental difference between an independent executive agency and a cabinet agency is that the independent executive agencies report directly to the president, whereas in, say, the Department of State, you would have the sub-offices underneath that would report all the way up to the Secretary of State. Okay, in terms of the qualifications and the terms of the executive, the President of the United States needs to be at least 35 years old. They need to be a natural-born citizen. Constitutional scholars have basically defined that as being born in the United States. According to the 14th Amendment, that automatically makes you a citizen, or one or both of your parents is a U.S. citizen. And you also have to be a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. The Vice President and other executive officials really don't have any constitutional qualifications or term limits, but a good way to think about it is that the Vice President would need to have the same qualifications as the President in order for them to assume the presidency. So anyone who didn't meet those criteria would obviously be skipped over in the line of succession. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the executive list of succession. So if the president were to die or become incapacitated in office, the vice president would become president of the United States. Now, the Constitution originally did not state this, and there was some degree of confusion about this until it was codified in the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment was passed after Ronald Reagan was shot and was going into surgery. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, was out of the country, and for a hot minute, his chief of staff and the Speaker of the House both claimed that they were acting as president. Now, of course, the Cold War was going on during this time period, and leaving that level of confusion out there in the world was certainly not a good thing. The 25th Amendment clearly states out the list of succession. After the vice president, it would be the Speaker of the House. Keep in mind that the Speaker is elected separately from the president and vice president, so it's possible that you could have a Speaker of the House from a different party than the president or vice president become president. Now, we've never gotten that far down in the line of succession. No speaker has ever assumed the presidency in that way. After the Speaker of the House, it would be the President pro tempore, and then the cabinet agency leaders by the order of the agency in which it was created. So the newest agency would be first in line, last in line, the oldest agency would be first in line. Fun little fact for you, every State of the Union address where all the members of government come together, one cabinet member is always purposely left out and put in a secure location in case an atomic bomb were dropped on the Capitol. We would still have one person left in line for succession of the president. So that way you can sleep well at night. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the structure of the judiciary. So at the federal level, now keep in mind there's an entire different system at the state level, right? But in terms of federal courts, the lowest levels are the trial courts. Now that doesn't make them any less important. They actually do the vast majority of the work in the system. There are 94 of them geographically spread out throughout the United States. So if you're guilty of committing some kind of federal crime like racketeering, or you shoot a federal official, or you commit a crime with a gun that crossed state lines, you're going to end up in a U.S. district court. Now, let's say you lose that case and you don't like the outcome of the decision and you feel like you have grounds to appeal. Let's say that you had a problem with your lawyer or you feel like your civil rights were violated in some way. You can appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Now, there are 13 of those, again, spread geographically across the United States. There's one located right in our own downtown at the Thomas F. Eagleton Courthouse building. And they will hear your case and then decide whether or not to overturn the lower district court ruling. Now, if there is some kind of conflict between decisions from two different courts of appeals, which happens, sometimes an appeals court in California rules differently than the appeals court in St. Louis, and those two decisions have to be reconciled, that's one way that cases end up at the U.S. Supreme Court, which of course is the last court of appeal. And lastly, in terms of qualifications in the terms of the judiciary, there really are no constitutional qualifications for judges. Basically, they serve for life as long as they maintain good behavior, which is certainly somewhat subjective. They can be removed, however, through impeachment, and that has happened before. In total, 15 judges, 3 presidents, and a cabinet member, and a U.S. senator have all been impeached by the House. But only 3 times in these cases, and they were all judges, were they convicted by the Senate. The most recent one was a judge named Thomas Porteous from Louisiana, who was convicted of corruption in 2010. I hope you took good notes, and please bring any questions to class.